about to talk to you about now will be perceived as many, can be considered in an incredible number of countries around the world. And I'm not talking about backwater countries, I'm talking about countries that we spend time in and participate in. I'm talking about England, Scotland, Wales, France, all the European nations, South Africa, Australia, Canada. They have created laws about hate speech. And hate speech, I remember writing about this in Britain a few years ago, and listen, we've had experience with this, that to say anything that offends people who are committing these sins is considered hate speech and is punishment under criminal action. Punishable under criminal action. In other words, it is against the law to say anything against homosexuality. Now, the reason I'm talking about this, and I didn't mean this session to be about homosexuality, but you cannot discuss what Paul wrote to the church without getting involved in a discussion of homosexuality. That's right. Because that's what he talks about. That's what he's talking about, right? Now, I'm 69 years old as we do this, all right? Now, that may, some of you are saying, how can anybody be that old? But let me tell you something. In the scheme of things, that's not a long time, all right?
No, it isn't.
In the scheme of world history, that's not a long time. And yet, in that period of time, which on a global scale, is really kind of brief, I have seen homosexuality go from being prohibited to being permitted to being protected to being promoted.
That's right.
Now think about that, because that's important, because this has happened in a very brief period of time. As a matter of fact, I say in my lifetime. Television shows are in their own way, and so many movies today, so much music, everything, our entertainment world is promoting the concept of homosexuality. They're not just permitting it, they're not just allowing it, they're promoting it. In 1 Samuel 8:11, I'm going to read this to you, because I want you to understand that when the people of God wanted to be like the other nations, like the world, right? The Lord spoke to Samuel, because remember they came to Samuel and said, give us a king that we might be like the other nations. And God spoke to Samuel and he said, this will be the procedure of the king who will reign over you. In other words, God said, okay, that's what you want, that's what you're going to have. But here's the way it's going to be. And the first thing he says, the very first thing is, he says, he will take your sons and place them in the chariots. But I want you to know, he says, he'll take your sons. 2 verses later, he says, he will also take your daughters. So God says, one of the first things that's going to happen is when you submit yourself and desire this worldly government, and he said, because you have rejected me as being king over you, right?
Right.
The first thing that's going to happen is they're going to take your sons and daughters. The humanists knew that the attack had to be on the next generation.
Yes.
They weren't going to convince, and can't convince, people like me overnight, who have been raised understanding that this is immoral, unacceptable behavior. They're not going to change my mind.
Yeah.
But they knew, like Hitler did with the Hitler Youth. They knew, like Stalin did. They knew, because the devil knows, get the children and raise them up.
In their formative years.
In their formative years. Almost 30 years ago, just almost exactly 30 years ago, I was teaching a Bible study in the book of Revelation, and I mentioned humanism as a false religion in that study. Now remember, this was 30 years ago. And the people of the study were not familiar with humanism. And particularly as I felt it was making such inroads on the governmental school system, because a lot of people coming to the study had children in schools, right? Grammar schools, elementary schools, high schools, right? So I was telling them that this humanism was making inroads on the government school system and on their children who attended those schools. Now, they were skeptical about that. So because of their skepticism, the very next day after I mentioned this, I went to the public library in town. And this is long before the internet, right? You had to walk, go down, travel, truck down to the library. And I found out that there was a magazine that was published by these, when I talk about humanist organizations, let me just backtrack and stop and you bring me back on track here. Those humanist manifestos, they're not some wild-eyed fanatics sitting in those things were signed by some of the most prominent educators and writers in the world at the times that they were printed, right? And yes, I did say prominent educators around the world, right? Okay.
So you're at the library.
So I go to the library, and I find out, well, this humanist organization, they have a monthly magazine, or a bi-monthly magazine, called The Humanist. So I picked up the current copy. When I picked up the copy of this, now remember, none of this is planned. I went to the library because of what had happened at the Bible study the night before. I pick up the magazine, and here are the words that I read. This is from a man named John Dunphy, and he wrote an article in the Humanist magazine, and here's what it said. I am convinced that the battle for humankind's future must be waged and won in the public school classroom by teachers that correctly perceive their role as proselytizers of a new faith, a religion of humanity that recognizes and respects the spark of what theologians call divinity in every human being. The classroom must and will become an arena of conflict between the old and the new. The rotting corpse of Christianity, together with all its adjacent evils and misery, and the new faith of humanism, resplendent with the promise of a world in which never realized Christian ideal of love thy neighbor will finally be achieved. That's the Humanist magazine, January, February 1983.